Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I realise it's been a long day and your brain might be quite full. If it isn't, I promise it will be. I have quite a lot of content for you. Mike just mentioned joined in. If you can't see the screen, the slides are already linked from the joined in page, so feel free to just grab them onto your device if that would be helpful. Hello, I'm Lorna. I'm here to talk to you about OpenAPI. I love OpenAPI so much that now I'm on their technical steering committee and I help to maintain that open standard. It's a real treat for me to come back to PHP, which is kind of my origin tech community. This is where I learned all my skills. But also because I speak at lots of other events and PHP really is the right language for building back-end APIs. So I don't have to tiptoe around and try not to be too rude about your tech stack. You've made good choices. So let's talk a little bit about OpenAPI. If you're here, hopefully you know why. If not, here's a quick intro. OpenAPI is a standard way of describing APIs. The idea is that it's for humans and for machines. You use either YAML or JSON, so you tell me if that's human-friendly or not. But that's the goal, right? The goal is we have a way that we can write and read, and the machines can write and read, and they describe every aspect of your API. The way that I think about OpenAPI as a concept is it's an interoperability standard. It allows us to describe an interface that others can integrate with, or it allows us to integrate with interfaces described and published by others. It isn't really an output format, and we'll talk more about that later, but it does have its roots in developer experience, API experience, consistent documentation, so it can sometimes feel a little bit PHP doc output-ish. If you haven't seen OpenAPI before, it looks something like this. This is not a whole OpenAPI document. It's like a third of the shortest OpenAPI description that I know, which is from Dataset. One thing that I think is an important thing to acknowledge when we talk about working with OpenAPI is that sometimes those files are kind of long. It's a verbose format. You can be dealing with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lines of JSON or YAML. So there are some inbuilt complexities of wrangling a thing that size. Yeah, I just want to say that out loud. Sometimes it's hard. However, it is not rocket science. Look at it. You can read this. You can write this. There's no magic. It's also open standard, so you can get as involved as you want. The format isn't the hard part. The process is the hard part. Getting started is easy. Doing this well is hard. I've come today to try to share with you what I know and give you a bunch of different scenarios that if they apply in your setting or in any of your projects, give you some ideas of how you could take the next step along the way in each of those situations. Before I get too deeply into that, I want to talk a little bit about the code first and design first process alternatives. You'll often hear rhetoric, frankly, about using design first. Oh, you should always design your APIs before you build them. Yes, ideally. And if you are doing first-class API products, any complex systems, if you're doing this at any big level of maturity, yes, you need a design-first workflow. I didn't come here to tell you that if you are code first, you're doing it wrong. I came to invite you to consider what you can do starting from where you are today. If your API is how your users sign up to your newsletter or edit their subscription, and it has 2 endpoints. I don't care if you're code first. Actually, that sounds like a pretty good fit. Right? If your whole business is around a large and complex API used by multiple integrations, oh yeah, you should be design first, right? So it's a little bit like if you want to go fast, do what you like. But if you want to go far, we're going to go design first and create open API descriptions that have API experience at their core, that have examples, that show all of the possibilities, that have meaningful descriptions, that are going to give your API users a wonderful experience. We want them to be successful with the APIs that we build, and that's really the goal with OpenAPI. So today, I'm going to show you some tools, and I'm going to share my tactics. Some of them are API rhetoric, and some of them are probably fix it this way. So we've got a bit of a mix for you. The first scenario, and you don't have to put up your hand if this is familiar to you, but you've heard about this OpenAPI thing, but the API already exists. Don't worry. If you don't have an OpenAPI file for your API yet, you've got a bunch of options. And there's nothing to say that the way that you built your APIs before is the way that you have to carry on building your APIs tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year. 2 really good options to start with. One is you can generate, depending on your code base, you may be able to generate an OpenAPI description from your code. This won't give you everything you need, but it can give you a really good structure that you can then go ahead and write the rest of the OpenAPI description and switch over to a design-first workflow. So that's a good starting point. Not all APIs can have OpenAPI generated from them. It depends what they're made of. Your modern frameworks, it probably will work. Some of the more legacy stuff, it probably won't. When I was putting this talk together, I had massively too much content. So for this story, you need to go and look on my blog. But I took the joined-in API, which doesn't have an OpenAPI description, because I had not heard of it when I built that, cannot have an OpenAPI generated from its code, because it does not use a framework. There were no good ones at that time. Check the commit log, ask me how I know. And the way that I approached that is I used a sniffing tool to just put in as a proxy, run some API tests, and the proxies will document the requests and responses that they saw, and again, just give you that OpenAPI structure. This is not the file that you can use for anyone else, but it gives you the structure where you can then go ahead and add the examples, the format information, the descriptions, and so on. So it's a nice starting point. And you're going to do something like this. I've got the sniff traffic in the middle. I use Optic. There are other perfectly good tools. You run your API tests over here. Joined in doesn't have API tests. I wrote a curl script for this part. And you pass that, you just have to make some traffic that goes through their server, right? Make traffic. However you do that, do that. And it hits the API server. And this sort of man-in-the-middle type proxy inspects everything going in both ways and then gives you an output of what it saw. So this can be a nice way to get an open API for a project that doesn't have it yet. And especially if you're working with legacy systems, this flow will help you. Optic can also run anytime in this sort of setup with your API tests. It will report on anything it saw that didn't match the OpenAPI description, and it can also update your OpenAPI, so that's cool. Here's a scenario. You publish an API, and humans use it, or humans need to be able to understand it to build integrations. You will need some API reference documentation. Your OpenAPI can become human readable when you render it in some kind of human-facing thing, so use one of the docs tools. You might have heard of Redoc. It's been around quite a while. So there are some really awesome new docs tools on the block these days. My favorite is Scalar. And you should also try Bump, which does some really nice on-demand docs as well. So you're going to take your OpenAPI reference and generate, I mean, you've seen this. You can take your OpenAPI file and create some reference documentation. Some of them have interactive features. Your mileage will absolutely vary. So we've got your OpenAPI, wherever we had to magic it from. We've published some docs of it. This is cool. When you're doing design first, you are going to propose changes in the OpenAPI description, and that's the only thing we do. Generate some docs from it, deploy a mock server if you would like to. Get this to be signed off by probably the people who have to consume this API. I'd recommend your tech writers take a look at this point, your product people. And when you're happy, then implement. Why do it this way? We need to move the design process as far left as humanly possible. When we ship ordinary application code, we can kind of ship it and iterate. And for APIs, we absolutely cannot do that. You have to ship it right first time. So get the wisdom of the crowds over here, review the designs, put docs in front of everybody, spin up some preview servers. It's usually a pull request with a diff of the OpenAPI changes as well. And when everybody's happy, it's a breeze to implement and deploy it. It also gets away from the situation for us as developers where you get told to expose something in the API and you do it, and the feedback you get is not like that. Drives me mad. Just like write the interface. If you know what you want, then tell me. Okay, so we've got this API. We've rendered some docs for it. I want you to think about a project that you know with OpenAPI and tell me, could that OpenAPI file be better in any way? This is the most industry standard problem ever. You have an OpenAPI file and it could be better. This is a problem that every project I have ever seen, even if it's design first, has. Especially if you're generating code, it can be hard to improve your OpenAPI. Even if you are generating from code, you've got some options. OpenAPI has recently released a new specification standard. It's the overlay specification. It describes a series of edits for an OpenAPI document. So this means even if the beginning of your pipeline is generated or something else that you have no control over, or it's a third-party API, so you're doing stuff with something you can't change, an overlay lets you make a repeatable change or set of changes to that OpenAPI. You can edit stuff, you can delete stuff. It's got JSON path matching, so you can do something for all of the delete endpoints, or everything tagged like this, or everything marked X internal, or every parameter called something _ date. Whatever. You can edit in that way. So this is a wonderful kind of opening door to the thing you wish you could make better about the OpenAPI description that you are forced to use. I think it's new because the standard only went to 1.0 in October, but actually we released the specification formally after we realized that a bunch of tools vendors needed this so badly they had already implemented it, right? So there are tools that are out there that are ready, that are hardened, that are being actively used, they're open source. So check out the Speakeasy and Bump tooling for nice overlay tools. Overlays doesn't cover all use cases. Don't be afraid to wrangle, and change your OpenAPI description in whatever way you need. There are some other transform tools. Redocly has some decorator stuff that you can run. I have also seen an alarming number of excellent solutions that mostly use JQ. Just don't be afraid of this, right? Do the thing that you need to do and build up your pipeline. There's a lot of use cases for overlays. You can improve the descriptions. If you're going to use your OpenAPI to generate SDKs, this works better if it's a bit more complete than maybe you get from generated code. Especially error responses, they have to be in the OpenAPI description so that your generated SDK knows about them and handles them appropriately, right? So all of that kind of filling in the gaps, polishing the pieces part, you can do with overlays. The other big use case that I see for overlays is in what I call output overlays. Because we use our open APIs as the source of truth for so many different tools, we render documentation, you probably have some deployment stuff going to API gateways, there'll be some governance stuff, there's probably more than one set of SDK generation, because no single tool seems to do a great job for all tech stacks. I hope the situation will get better. The output overlays allow you to add a bunch of extra metadata purely for a particular destination tool. Your SDK generator needs a bunch of type hinting, method naming, and all this sort of stuff that you might not want to put in the OpenAPI that you publish for users. You can also use overlays to filter down your OpenAPI. So if you want to hide the experimental endpoints, the deprecated endpoints, the admin-only endpoints, everything that's under a certain path, that's easy. And it means that you don't have to maintain multiple OpenAPI versions, and you don't get in a situation where you can't put something into an OpenAPI description because you can't, the docs come off that and you're only allowed one, right? We start to think about it more as a kind of pipeline and things change. Working on the overlays, they're very, very human read-write, but also there's a bunch of tools to help you. My favorite is the speakeasy tools. You can take your OpenAPI file, make a copy of it, edit this copy however you want. Just put it in front of the product owner, see what they do, then run the compare tool. The overlay serves as a diff format for OpenAPI. And so those edits can be repeatedly applied every time because you've captured them in an overlay. There's a nice web GUI for it as well. You might also choose to do a couple of edits and then use that base format to write more stuff by hand. It has pattern match because it's got the JSON path features. So some things like per endpoint description fields, that's one per endpoint, you'll edit, that's fine. But where you want to do it to all the post endpoints or something like that, then you will write that one yourself. Once you've got it, your overlay goes in your repo and it gets applied on build as part of your API description pipeline. Again, there's some really good tools for you. I have documentation for this on learn.openapis.org. There are some examples there. I wrote those docs, so please feel free to open issues or pull requests or file complaints. You'll get me on the other end of it. I would be delighted to talk to you about that. It's definitely a work in progress. Here's the speakeasy tool that I mentioned. This is your original OpenAPI on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is your overlay. And the middle pane shows what happens when the overlay is applied to the OpenAPI. Fun fact, you can edit either the middle or the right-hand side panes and they update. It's beautiful. Okay. You can see here that I'm adding some summary stuff, some better descriptions, some improvements in my little overlay example. When I did this for Joined In, I did not do this. What I actually did was, we had static documentation. I had a generated terrible OpenAPI that just had parameter names. And I fed the two things into an LLM and said, go. And it did a decent job. So there's lots of options for how to get to the beginning of the OpenAPI, but it should have, you need descriptions, you need examples, you need to delight your users. If all you have is a list of paths and a list of parameters and some pasted responses, you are at best halfway there. Please keep going. Oh, we talked about humans using your API. Let's talk about code using your API. If your OpenAPI, the better your OpenAPI is, the better your generated SDKs will be. One important thing I want you to think about for SDKs is there's no rule that says only the producer is allowed to generate SDKs. I have quite often generated SDKs for things that I am consuming. Even if the API producer produces SDKs, there's all sorts of reasons why that isn't the right thing to integrate with my system. But given the OpenAPI file, I can generate whatever I need to with whatever version dependencies I want in the tech stack that I'm using. You've also just seen the thing with the overlays where you can reduce your OpenAPI file for a particular output. If you have 200 endpoints and I use 2 of them, maybe I'm just going to filter those 2 into a little OpenAPI description and generate from that some client code that I can easily use, right? Because I may not need all of it, and if you have some funky encoding happening in some endpoint that I don't need, can give me a lot of dependencies, and I don't want that. Top tip, actually more than one top tip. The first top tip, joint top, is you need to try a bunch of different providers for generating SDKs. Nearly all of them do 1 or 2 tech stacks really, really well. And if you're publishing SDKs in more languages than that, you might need more tools than that in the mix. It's very likely that you have tried to do this and had a bad experience. I'm sorry, it's a hard problem. This is a really, really hard thing to do well. All of them output essentially garbage code that you would never want to use. That's just the nature of the beast. But different tools do a better and worse job for different target stacks. So don't be afraid to go to town and have different ones for different requirements. The other joint top tip is here. Your generated code gen, has output. You're going to put it here in this subdirectory. You're going to regenerate what goes in there, and you're never going to edit it. Every new release of the code generator, or maybe a change in its upstream dependencies, will cause different outputs. And at some point, that will be a disastrous and breaking change that you don't like, right? Some of these tools have some AI in the mix, meaning it's not even deterministic, anything could happen. Put the generated code in the generated code folder. Do not mess with it. Now write the smallest little shim wrapper layer you've ever written and put it in the root directory. At some time in the future, you will thank your past self because something will happen where the generated code isn't exactly what you wanted, or we need to patch over a change between multiple versions of the API or whatever. This is your insurance. Now, I'm giving you good advice. I cannot force you to take it. Please don't feel obliged to tell me when you regret not taking my advice at some future time. I learned this the hard way, actually more than once. So yeah, do as I say, not as I do. Also on this photo, picture, whatever the hell this is, a diagram, is the OpenAPI. You will publish your OpenAPI to your API users. That is important. You can publish other things. SDKs, Postman collections, documentation are all wonderful. You must publish the OpenAPI. It is for the users. And yes, don't be afraid to generate for your own. Okay, let's talk a little bit about API governance. This belongs at different places in your pipeline depending on your workflow. In an ideal world, you're design first, you have a bunch of well-established, written down API standards. If they're not written down, they're not API standards, they're an idea. They're an imaginary fairy tale, I don't know, you need to write them down. Write down your API standards, and where you can, put in some linting to automatically check them all. We all really enjoy APIs that are really consistent. They get to feel really familiar. The plurals and the casing are the same everywhere. You really settle in and feel at home. The ones that are not like that, you've all had experiences of working with those. Like this one's item and that one's users, but it's account and orders, and now you're tearing your hair out. Some things are a snake case and some things are camel case, and you wonder if actually these developers ever met each other. API standards, having some API governance in your workflow will help a lot. If you're design first, it can go absolutely over here, straight on the left. You propose the change, the docs get generated, you get the linting. I mean, in theory, you run this locally, and in practice, it's always the CI telling me things. You get some annotations for what needs to change. And so you can do the automatic part of the review right up front with the change. There will be things in your API standards that you cannot automatically check. The most obvious example that needs humans is, does this naming make sense? I'm very good at linting rules. I do not have a linting rule for, yes, this makes sense. I should sell it if I did. I don't. So it needs to go through, bring together the stakeholders. Sounds very grand, but whoever's building this thing, whoever asked for it to be built, and whoever's using it, sit them round a table and get them to agree this is all fine, and then go ahead and implement. If you are code first, it's just a longer feedback loop. I'm sorry, you're going to build the code, generate the OpenAPI, run the linting, realize you shouldn't have called it that. Hopefully you can run it all locally. It's going to be fine. Tools to try Spectral or Vacuum. Spectral is part of the Stoplight stuff. They're both open source. Vacuum's written in Go, so it's quite fast, even on big OpenAPI descriptions. So that is pretty great. Yeah, get some governance. This stuff makes you look like a joined-up thinker, right? But write your own rules. Never. My recommendation is, if you ever see a rule set called recommended, recommend you run away. This is never the right rule set. I don't care what rule set you use, it's not the one named recommended. I do not recommend any recommended rule sets. There's a long story about how we got to this place, and I'm very sorry. I cannot fix it. Please write your own rules, or get another rules, borrow a rule set from someone else or something. Yeah, the defaults are just wrong, and all the tools copied each other. So, sorry. Okay, let's talk about some other scenarios. How about if you don't have an API sandbox or test platform and you'd like one? Again, your OpenAPI description is going to help you enormously, because you can use the OpenAPI file and give it to some kind of mocking tool, of which there are many. And it will do, you can see here, it's pretending to be the API server. Now, sometimes you actually will want a proper testing or staging platform with the actual API deployed and some pretend data set up or whatever. That's cool. Throwing up a mock server is a great way to test integrations. I also love it as a way to evaluate proposed design changes. So design first, I would like to make a change to our API. Here is the OpenAPI YAML diff change that I would like to make. And I will immediately spin up a mock server, generate some documentation, and try and imagine this API. In theory, you only need the docs, and in practice, I just think better. With my favorite API client, hitting a mock server, hitting the other endpoints that I know about, and sort of working my way through, does this make sense to do the thing that this is the answer to that problem? My favorite tools for this are Prism and Microx. Your experience with mock API servers will only be as good as your OpenAPI description is. That is why you've just had to sit through 20 minutes of me explaining how important it is to have a really good OpenAPI description, and how to add things, and how to flesh it out, and how to make it amazing. The multiple response examples are the magic here, right? the error responses, the 2 or 3 different types of object responses, an empty collection response, all of that goes in your OpenAPI description, will be correctly handled by the SDK generators that we just talked about, and you can test all of those scenarios really easily because your mock server will know how to return them all from it. If you have a minimal OpenAPI that you generated from code by pressing a button or running a command somewhere, this is kind of a disappointing experience. But the reason it's a disappointing experience is because there's more work to do in the OpenAPI description. And I'm sorry, I wish there was a button to make it all awesome. And there just isn't. But once you've done the work, it repays you back all the way through your process. Mock servers, I love it for reviewing the designs. You can start the front and back end projects on the same day, just agree what's going on in the exchange, and then the front end can develop against the mock while you actually build the real thing. It sounds like a fairy tale, but I have more than once plugged together those 2 things on launch day and it's worked. I promise you, this is achievable, it's a real thing, it's not API rhetoric. And it helps enormously. It's only as good as the information you give it, so there's that. I really like to put up a mock server as part of my CI, like just build it, put it up for a while. We can try stuff. We can try the other parts of the system against this change. There's a bunch of things you can do here. I use microcs, particularly locally, if I'm just deployed locally, although it has all the CI, like CLI stuff that you can use. I realise you can't read that from there. Doesn't really matter. It shows me, hey, here's an endpoint, and these are the responses that I know about. So I can click on a response, I can get the URL and make the call, and see, with my API client, see all the different responses that might come back from this. Some of them have some fuzzing, so you can get some, oh, well, you said you could have any UUID here, so instead of always returning the same one, I'm going to generate you one. Or, so there's some different ones do different things. Microx is pretty clever, that it will try and look at what parameters you have and be smart about which things it's going to run, which is pretty nice. So that's the API sandbox. While we're in this kind of client-server OpenAPI type space, I want to talk about API drift. API drift is a huge problem. It's when you've got your OpenAPI description, you've got your API code implementation, and somebody makes a change in the code, but they don't update the OpenAPI description, or we do a design first. Oh, I followed all your guidelines. We all reviewed the design in a formal way with our API council. And then it turns out, isn't exactly what was implemented? And the 2 things just get further and further and further apart. API drift. I think this is what leads organizations to kind of stay in this code generated OpenAPI and the 2 are locked together. Sort of feels safe, doesn't it? It feels good. Except I've just said loads of rude things about that. Sorry. It's a really great starting point, and I'm not here to tell you that you're doing it wrong. There are other ways that we can have all of the cake that I've just described and eat it, and avoid the API drift. Now I've got drifting cake. This is a very mixed metaphor. And the thing that's going to help us here is contract testing. Your contract testing is going to look at, here's your API client, here's your API server, here's what's going on in the middle. This is what you wrote down in the OpenAPI description. What? So this is the tool that's going to read the traffic and be like, well, you never said about that field. What's that doing in the response? Who made this endpoint? I've never seen that before. Right, so your contract testing is what's going to help you lock these 2 things together without being limited to only having what's in the code in your OpenAPI description. Microx, again, is a good option. I also like WireMock, and we've talked a bit about Pact as well. There's a bunch of these. If you're using Laravel, I've heard of a thing called Spectator, but I haven't tried it. It'll plug into your test suite. The important thing here is that you are going to run this against a deployed version of the code. Don't use it against your mock server, because all you're doing is verifying that the OpenAPI matches the OpenAPI. This is not going to work. And your setup looks something like this. So again, you're generating some API traffic. This is probably not your production traffic, although I have seen that. It's usually, you're going to do this when you're running your API tests or your integration tests, your end-to-end tests, just get all of that there. Something that takes in your OpenAPI YAML and just lets you know if it sees anything that doesn't match that API description. Other things you can do here, you might want to run like a little fractional proportion of your live traffic through it, just to keep an eye on things. I've also seen, if it's really, really critical that everything's going through this, then copy the traffic and run the contract test as a sort of secondary thing. Don't get in your, it's not super heavy, but I still don't want this in my production thing. So API drift, I'm not telling you that it's not a real problem, but I'm telling you, you can go big on how amazing your OpenAPI is and develop confidently without losing that connection between the two, and this is how. All the way through, I have talked about how your OpenAPI is not an output format. It is not a thing where we have some code, we generate the OpenAPI, we are now awesome, and many tools can occur. It's not impossible to have a really great experience maintaining all of this OpenAPI content in your code base and somehow generating it out, but it is absolutely no fun. So we're going to think about your API description pipeline. So whatever you're starting from, if you're design first, hopefully it's good and you are going to be just adding transforms and changes for specific output tools, or filtering for specific audiences. So giving you different lenses to present different aspects of your OpenAPI. If you're generating, then there are tools that can help you to sort of flesh out the rest of the OpenAPI to delight your API users. And don't for a moment think this is only important for public APIs. I like my colleagues just as much as my paying customers. And I like to make their developer experience just as good. I could argue that it matters even more for an internal audience, because where a bad experience hurts the same business that you work for and not just someone else's bottom line. Your API description might have inputs from multiple places. If you have a bunch of microservices you make into one API surface, that's a really common pattern. You might apply multiple transform steps of overlays or other kinds. You might adjust it for different outputs, and you might choose to make multiple OpenAPI files as your output. And remember, you can do all this magic as an API consumer. All of us use third-party APIs, and all of these tricks are available to us to improve our developer experience wherever we need it. Before I wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about OpenAPI itself as a project and as a community. OpenAPI is an open standard. That's really important to us as users of APIs. It means that nothing happens to OpenAPI that we didn't see coming. It's developed in the open, it's public, you can come and join the technical meetings or get involved in the GitHub activity or the Slack group. There's nothing there that isn't already available to you. And because it's an open standard, many vendors bet on it. I understand that there is an absolutely bewildering selection of tools. And since we have unbundled API management, you will use 4 or 5 different vendors probably throughout your API lifecycle for different stages. It's a feature, right? I promise. It's a feature. The open standard is what gives you the choice. It's not that somebody invents the standard and you buy their tools. That's where we started. But because it's open, we're all part of it. We can all use it. We can all build tools. If you don't find the tool that you need, then go ahead. I find myself doing this reasonably often. Usually then someone else makes a better version. So I feel like I'm just laying down a challenge and then somebody builds the real one, and it's quite good. OpenAPI is part of the Linux Foundation, so we have some formal governance, which I hope gives you some confidence that this is a real thing. Everything you need, I started putting together a big list of links for you, but basically, go to openapis.org, where you will find links to the specs, the repositories, the documentation, everything. There's a lot happening in the project. If you don't need all of it, maybe sign up for the newsletter, because we don't send that often, but we'll tell you if anything happens. It's quite a nice way to integrate with it if this is not your full-time thing. OpenAPI has had a few standards released in the last 6 to 12 months. Overlays, I mentioned. Overlays are a way of mapping repeatable amendments onto an OpenAPI file. So if you need to make those edits again, the source file might change and you need to also make those amendments for the output, then the overlay standard will help you, and there is tooling ready for you to use. We've also had a RATSO. This was known as API workflows while it was under development. A RATSO is like its marketing name or something. There are legal reasons why we had to call it that, but anyway. It describes a workflow. It's a sequence of API calls. So if you have a scenario where, in order to achieve a task, a user needs to call this API endpoint and then that API endpoint, maybe right now you're doing that in Postman with the script that runs after your request or whatever. This is a formal, specified way of describing those relationships and saying, make this call from this OpenAPI description and then use that value in this call to that endpoint from that OpenAPI description. And only if it is successful by these criteria, go ahead and do this with the result of it. Right, so you can chain a whole lot of things together. As we move to more complex API workflows, it's early days for RATSO, but listen out for it, because I think the tooling is coming. I'm starting to see testing tooling. I'm starting to see linting tooling. Everything is happening. Oh, and OpenAPI itself. Let's talk about OpenAPI. OpenAPI itself, we did a patch release in about October, which is 3.1.1. Essentially nothing to see here. Hopefully you're already on 3.1. It's 4 years old. If not, maybe we could talk about why not. There's some really good stuff in 3.1. 3.2 is, I have another slide deck where 3.2 is labeled soon and 4.0 is labeled later. We're volunteers. It takes as long as it takes. 3.2 I expect to be in the next few months, probably this year certainly. And it's got better support for some of the newer OAuth 2 things, some new OIDC stuff, and it has improved tags. So you can have multiple categories of tag, you can nest your tags, and they get a summary field. So if you're using extensions on tags, 3.2 probably solves some of those problems for you. It's also not released yet, so if you are using extensions on tags, please check that we've done something that's going to work for you. This would be a great time to tell me if we haven't. OpenAPI 4.0, codename Moonwalk, is a reimagination of what we could have done the first time around with OpenAPI. The goal is to have a much more inclusive way of referring to HTTP operations. So there'll be more different ways of declaring signatures. If you have something that looks a bit more RPC-ish or is very polymorphic, this stuff is going to help you a lot, but it is not anytime soon. If those are problems that you want to help solve, please get involved with the Moonwalk group. Have a look at what they're doing. There's a good understanding of the separation of the API design and the API deployment. It's very exciting, but you can't use it today. All right. OpenAPI is a standard for API descriptions. It can help you a lot in the work that you do. And I hope that there's something here that just shows you something that you can improve, just maybe one or two things in your own practice, either as a consumer or as a producer. I have a massive list of resources, which I will also put out on my social channels in a minute when I sit down and publish the draft it's not a tweet, but you know. And with that, I will just say thank you so much for your attention.